Hello, I'm Angel Alvarez. Welcome to Pace TV. Here we are at the Rancho Bernardo Historical Society, which is located on the beautiful grounds of the Bernardo Winery in Rancho Bernardo. With us today is historian Vince Rossi, who will take us through an extremely interesting timeline here at the museum to show us what happened in the past. Welcome, Vince.
Thank you, Angel. Thanks for having us.
Have you always been interested in history? Is it something you thought about since you were a child?
I studied it in college, and I was later able to make a career out of it as a freelance writer. From 2004 to 2008, I wrote local history articles for the Union Tribune, and I've written 3 local history books about San Diego County.
Okay, and as I understand it, some of the original occupants or people who lived were the Kumeyaay?
Kumeyaay, the people we know today as the Kumeyaay Nation, were in San Diego County for roughly about 10,000 years before the first Europeans came. They were the original residents. Yeah, they tended to migrate with the seasons, and they established semi-permanent villages seasonally in the coastal areas, the inland areas, and the mountains. So we know there were at least a couple of villages in the Rancho Bernardo area. In 1769, Spanish soldiers and Franciscan missionaries came, landed at what we today call the city of San Diego, established a mission, San Diego de Alcalá, and a fort or presidio. And then they proceeded to work their way up through what we today call California in a colonizing mission, establishing forts and missions all up and down the state. And the first name that appears for this area appears in maps in the early 1800s.
What kind of things do we see on the timeline? I mean, what are we looking at?
One of the things that it helped to sort of set up certain periods of the local history. We had first the Native American period, and then starting from 1769 to 1821 is the Spanish period, when this was part of the Spanish Empire, and all of California and a good part of today's southwestern states were part of the Spanish Empire. And that was true until 1821. And then in 1821, Mexico proclaimed its independence from Spain. And this area became part of the Mexican province of Alta California. That's Upper California to distinguish from Baja, the lower. But it was a part of Mexico. And the Mexican Republic, this was a relatively sparsely populated area, and the Mexican Republic was interested in getting more people in all these areas because they feared the competition from other European powers like the Russians and the English and the Spanish, who had colonies in various parts of the North American continent, and the upstart Americans who had come in. So they offered land to people who were willing to settle down, build a house or hacienda, and work the land, at least for a certain number of years.
Okay.
And one of the people that they offered land to and that took it was a man named Joseph Snook. He was a merchant ship captain. Originally he was an Englishman, born in England in late 1790s. He went to sea at an early age, and by the late 1820s, he was commanding his own merchant ship in the service of other merchants involved in trade of goods between Europe, South and Central America, and California. And like many Europeans who visited this area, he fell in love with California, and he decided he wanted to settle there, and he applied for a rancho grant. And he also had fallen in love with a young woman named Maria Alvarado, who was a resident of San Diego, whose ancestry was traced back to the original Spanish explorers. And so they got married in around 1837, and at first he got a grant for a rancho in Northern California. But after a few years, Maria apparently preferred to be closer to San Diego, so he reapplied, and between 1842 and 1845, he got a grant of Rancho San Bernardo, which was the rancho, what we today call Rancho Bernardo. And as part of the process at that time in the Mexican Republic, Joseph Snook had to apply, he had to convert to Catholicism and had to adopt a Latinized name, which he did. So he, in his records, in the mission records, which we have a copy of, Joseph Snook became Don Jose Francisco de Sales Snook. which always gets a chuckle when I give talks for local history. And that's not unusual. You had a lot of Europeans doing that. So he settled down, he got the grant, and the grant, Rancho San Bernardo, was 17,763 acres, which today would cover all of what we today call Rancho Bernardo, plus parts of Escondido and Poway. It extended, and parts of the San Pasqual Valley. It got subdivided as we'll learn later on. And so, but that was the original size of the rancho. It was a pretty big piece of real estate. And he stocked it with cattle, sheep, oxen, and it was an important livestock ranch and grain growing ranch. They grew, grain was what was considered dryland crops, where you didn't have a lot of water. They grew things like forms of wheat or barley, that sort of thing. And he grew that, and it was a thriving rancho. But in around 1846, Don Jose went to sea again. Ostensibly, just he got involved in the trading again, while Maria was home on the ranch there, along with his brother John, who had come over from England. But it's also been speculated that he got involved also in doing some spying for the Californios, because this was a period when tensions were starting to rise between the Mexican Republic and the bordering United States. So while he was there, while he was at sea, the battle in 1846, the Battle of San Pasqual, took place on and around the rancho, several different locations in the rancho. It was the bloody, that when the tensions boiled over into war with Mexico. And it was one of the bloodiest and most controversial battles of that war. That 19 Americans died, and we've never gotten a handle on the number of Californios. And there's still disputes about who won. But ultimately, the United States won the war, and Rancho San Bernardo and all of California now then became part of the United States. Around the same time as the treaty settling the war, Don Jose Snook passed away. And the rancho came into the hands of his brother John and his widow Maria, who he left a life estate. They had no children. Originally, and then within a few years, John died, and then Maria died, and the ranch was inherited by a group of Snook's nieces and nephews in England. But in 1867, they sold the rancho to a representative, a man named James McCoy, who was at that point the sheriff of San Diego County, and had been in the Mexican War and was a longtime political leader in San Diego County. And so you started to have a small population of small farmers that developed in what was also called the Bernardo Valley, or the San Bernardo Valley. That's the name you see in some of the books of the period. And as a result of the subdividing, at a certain point, there were enough people in the area to require a post office, regular mail delivery. And they applied for a post office, and the Postal Service created a post office called Bernardo. And the first post office was in Zenas Sykes' house. And the Sykes adobe is part of the San Diego River Park today, and you can see the house is restored, a 19th century house, basically just across the street from the Westfield North County Shopping Center. And the first post office, he was the first postmaster, Zenas Sykes, and the post office was in his kitchen. And then within a couple of years, 1872 was when that post office was opened, December 1872. Zenas Sykes sold some acreage just a half mile north of his place to an individual who built a small building and started a general store. And eventually the post office was moved there, and this person became the postmaster of Bernardo. And as a result of this subdividing and the movement into the area of these other ranchers, a small farming village developed. Another man came in, a blacksmith, erected a house and a blacksmith shop next door to the post office, and a little town developed, which came to be called the town of Bernardo. And Bernardo was a fairly thriving farming village from the 1870s till about the early 1920s. And then it disappeared, essentially, because of the competition of another developing town, Escondido, to the north, which incorporated in 1888 and began pulling commercial activity and residential activity away. And also, with the construction of the Lake Hodges Dam and Reservoir, played a role in that as well.
When was the Lake Hodges Dam put in then?
The dam was completed in 1918.
Oh, wow.
It was partly the result of the sale of the remaining unsubdivided acreage. At that point, the Rancho San Bernardo, what had been the original Snook Ranch, there were about 6,000 acres left of that had not been subdivided. And that passed through various hands, but by the mid-teens, it came into the hands of a man named Ed Fletcher, who was also a state senator and was, along with members of the Santa Fe Railroad and other individuals, very much involved in a lot of big irrigation projects in San Diego County. And so by the teens, there were about 6,000 acres left, and Fletcher and some other people got involved and created an entity called the San Dieguito Mutual Water Company to create a reservoir for the San Dieguito River, which flowed through the area. That's another aspect of the local history. In the decades previous, you see the river that flowed through this area of Rancho Bernardo, what we today call RB, was actually the San Dieguito River, but you also see references to it as the Bernardo River, where it flowed through Bernardo. Where it flowed through Santa Isabel, it was referred to as the Santa Isabel River. And there is an anecdote that Ed Fletcher once said in his autobiography, I sometimes felt we should call it the All Saints River because of all the names that flows through it. So anyway, Fletcher, they bought up a lot of land and built the reservoir. And as a result of them buying up some of the land, there were farmers who were bought out. And there was also some consolidation going on of smaller farmers being absorbed by larger operations growing, different things. So, but the dam was dedicated in 1918. And a year later, in 1919, right about now, September 1919, a new bridge was dedicated crossing the San Dieguito River about a quarter mile upstream from the town of Bernardo. And that also helped to seal Bernardo's fate, because what happened as a result of that bridge was the then owner of the general store, it went through various owners over the years, moved the store to the base of that new bridge, and it was renamed the Lake Hodges Station store instead of the Bernardo General Store, and that was part of the contribution for Bernardo basically going out of business. And the remaining 6,000 acres, once the dam was built, it was owned at that point by the San Dieguito Water Company, and in the late 20s, they began to lease the land to a man named George Daly. And George Daly was a member of, at that time, one of the biggest landowning families in San Diego County. He leased the land, grew wheat on it, and raised cattle. In late 1920s. He bought it outright in 1943. In 1957, he passed away, and the ranch was inherited by his nephews, Donald and Lawrence Daly. And they're the people we call the last ranchers of Rancho Bernardo, because they continued to operate it as a cattle ranch. And by the early 60s, it was still a ranch, and as Lawrence Daly said in an interview just before his death, most of the roads in this community at that point were still horse and mule trails rather than roads. But in November of 1961, Lawrence and Donald signed an agreement with Harry Summers, a developer named Harry Summers, and his partner Fritz Hahn, to create a joint venture to develop the ranch into a planned community. And after the agreement was signed, part of the agreement was they developed a community plan. Their idea was for a self-contained community with designated neighborhoods for different ages, community centers, schools, the idea, and workplaces where people could live, work within that community. The community plan was submitted to the city of San Diego with a request for annexation, because at that point this was still unincorporated county land. San Diego's northern border in 1961 stopped at Kearny Mesa. The city of San Diego agreed to annex the territory, adopted the plan, and they began developing what they called Rancho Bernardo. They shortened it from San Bernardo to Bernardo. I've gotten different reasons for that, but either way they called it Rancho Bernardo, and we today refer to it often as RB. And the ranch began to develop they started a publicity campaign with a newspaper. The first newspaper of the community was called Bernardo Brandings, and it was published by Bernardo Incorporated, and it was basically a newspaper which had no local circulation because there was nobody living there as yet, but they distributed it all over the country, and that's what brought in the residents. And the first model homes began to go up in the 61 and 62, representing the then neighborhoods of Bernardo Greens and Seven Oaks. by around first residents moved in 1963. They also built, that's when also when the Rancho Bernardo Inn and the golf course were completed. They were like the centerpieces of the new community to help draw people in. And by 1964, Rancho Bernardo had about 2,000 residents. And the original shopping center had 4 checkout lanes, the original Albertsons at the corner of Rancho Bernardo and Pomerado Roads. And then in the community began to grow steadily, and by 1982, it was up to around 20,000 people, and that's when the Rancho Bernardo Historical Society was established by some residents who were interested in preserving the history. And we're going to be going over to our president of our Historical Society, Nancy Canfield, to tell us more about that phase of the history.
Well, that's great. I thank you for being here with us, Vince, and hope to see you again soon. Nancy, you're the current president of the Historical Society here. How did this all come about? Whose idea and how did it get formed?
Originally, in the early 80s, some of the town leaders who began the real estate development, the service organizations such as Kiwanis and Rotary, different people like that who were sort of interested in being founding fathers and making the community a success, began meeting here at the winery with the owner, Ross Rizzo Sr., whose family owned the winery since 1957. And he grew up here. This was his homestead. And they made wine, they made olive oil, they grew grapes and the olives here, and still do. And he had a longing to preserve the history of the winery as well, especially as he saw the new development of the planned community coming in around him, and he wanted to keep this as an oasis of history. And so these men began talking about having a museum. So in 1982, they founded the Rancho Bernardo History Museum, or Historical Society actually. And they didn't have a museum for quite a long time, over 20 years. But they started asking people, please save your memorabilia, anything that designates your coming to Rancho Bernardo and your lifestyle here. And people did. They kept them in their garages and in their third bedroom and things like that. And in 2005, the tin can, as we call it affectionately, the storage unit was set up to begin a museum. And at the then San Diego Foundation was a small group of people who also wanted to raise money to begin the Rancho Bernardo softball teams and Little League. And they passed the hat, and each one donated $500. And that money was used to buy a used tool shed that they converted into our little exhibit hall and meeting and research room. So it was about as big as a tool shed, but it worked. And that's how we began on the far side of this property. There was a groundbreaking in 2007 for the backside of the property, a piece of land that Ross Rizzo Sr. had designated to build a museum. We had to come up with the money. We had to start the fundraising. And when I wandered over here in 2006, after they said hello, they said, do you know anything about fundraising? And I said, well, I'm the honorary mayor of Rancho Bernardo, and I had to raise money to get that job. And it's an honorary position. And so they said, you've got it. So from there, I began the plan development fundraising. And we built a team with various people that I mentioned before, but it was mostly the women from the U Foundation and from the other service organizations who were really interested, or I won't say interested, but involved in coming up with a plan. And we wanted to build visibility. We wanted to create events fundraisers, raise money, but constantly raising awareness at the same time about what we were trying to do. And as we gained momentum, people began to trust us and believe in us, and they would certainly donate money, but also start to give us their collections. We had outgrown the earlier facilities. We began to see we were outgrowing the new facilities that we moved into in 2009, and this was a series of suites, this building we're in now, in which there were little stores. And we were able to take it over in 2013. We completely renovated it using the money we had fundraised. And we continued to do some of the items that we had done before, such as the tile painting. We have events at various community centers where people will paint tiles and pay us $20. And then we have those tiles mounted on the outside of this building forever. The mud wagon was a grant. We started seeking grants, and we received from county supervisor a community development grant, and that mud wagon was built from scratch at the Bandy blacksmith shop in Escondido. It was a co-adventure, and all the money for the mud wagon was raised through the grant, but we did have to come up with some money of our own through our continued fundraising efforts. All of us today don't realize that what we're doing right now is creating history for tomorrow. We don't think about it, we think of it as the present. But in a situation where this community was building up around them and change was happening around them, they could see it. The cows were going away from the hills and houses were taking their place. Golf courses were being built. So it was changing before their eyes. And they said, before all of this is gone and the memory of what was and how it got to be this is gone, let's start preserving it. So one of the people on that development committee was one of the owners of the Brandings newspapers, acutely aware of the need to preserve history and tell the story. So over the next few years, we raised a total of about $250,000 towards building a museum. And our goal actually was $600,000. We wanted to raise $300,000 to build the museum and $300,000 for a legacy or an endowment to operate the museum. It didn't quite unfold like that because sadly in 2007, February of 2007, Ross Rizzo passed away. Unexpectedly, actually, he was only 67. And the family, there was a burden fell to the family, taxes, etc., and they were not able to meet his commitment to allow us to build the museum on that piece of land that is now a parking lot up above. And so what we did is we started to look around further alternatives around the community. Some organizations offered us property, but there were problems. One could not allow children to come. Well, we had an eye on an education program. One had a slippage problem, so we didn't want to put all this money in and have it slide down the hillside. So a variety of little things like that. So we started to look a little more closely here at the winery, and we discovered a building that was down at the end of the path here that was being used as a bride's preparation room. So they have a lot of weddings here. So we swept those young ladies out of there and leased that space. And that lasted us several years. And you can imagine coming out of the tin can and the tool shed, now we have heat and air conditioning. And of course, we're always mindful of preserving papers, photographs, books. So that was really, really important. And the same thing happened over a few years, we grew and grew. Fundraising events turned into permanent signature events, such as our annual Pancake Festival. It honors the military. We have it on Memorial Day every year, and it's a signature event in the community. We've had it for 12 years. So we developed our education program. We started having little scouts groups come in. We have ladies tours come in, such as the Red Hat Ladies or Seroptimists who will come in, or senior citizen groups from the Casa de las Campañas. And we also have a retired school teacher who goes into local elementary schools and teaches about the Kumeyaay Indians to third graders, because that's when the schools designate that they learn about the indigenous people of the area. Once a month, we have an excellent speaker. For instance, we recently had the CEO of the Maritime Museum, who is in charge of the Midway and the different ships down at the harbor. So we have free monthly programs, we have fundraiser programs. When the community decides they want an event, they always involve us, such as the time capsule. We were able to provide many items to put in the time capsule, original photographs, articles. And the other thing that we've done recently that's really valuable to the community is we digitized all the photographs, thousands of photographs, all of the brandings, newspapers, all of the original documents about the community development. And anyone can come in or even search from home, online, for free, all of these items.
Okay, a question now. This is a volunteer organization, a volunteer group. If our viewers were interested in becoming involved in this, what would they do, or what should they do?
The best avenue would be to go to our website, which is rbhistory.org. There will be directions how to contact us, how to become a member, and how to volunteer.
Well, Nancy, we thank you for being here. Now, if you're interested in visiting the Rancho Bernardo Historical Society Museum, please go to their website, rbhistory.org, for visiting hours. And I promise you that you will be fascinated by the wonderful museum that is here. And please visit us at Pace TV. Thanks for watching.
This worrisome land, I've got a home in that yonder city, good Lord. And it's not, good Lord, it's not made by hand.